thing, and how those are two sides of the same coin, really. And so we'll talk about Lord Narayana, Shiva, and Rudra predominantly here today. In the podcast that I did about the Brahma Sutras, I talked about that Shiva value, which is just like the backdrop or the silent witness, the almost like the canvas upon which all of this relative existence is lightly etched upon the face of. And the Shiva value is consciousness without opinion, without bias, without perspective, without any attachment to thingness, no thingness. The field of no thingness, that which transcends relativity. What I guess modern physicists might want to refer to as the unified field, perhaps the vacuum state. In mathematics, it's quite interesting because in set theory, a nice correlation there, in that all there is consciousness. There's nothing else, just consciousness. And that's represented by brackets in set theory. And why do I say that? Because consciousness by its nature is conscious of. And when it becomes conscious of something, it like puts it in brackets. And that's a set. And so there's pure consciousness, no thingness. And then there's the set containing consciousness. In other words, when consciousness becomes conscious of itself, self-aware. And those are two different things. And if consciousness can have those two things, it can become aware of those two, that creates a third thing. Those two things put in brackets. And then now we have three things, and it adds another thing. So put all that in brackets to get a fourth and a fifth. And it cascades out to infinity in a mathematically precise structure. But see, all that is born out of pure consciousness, no thingness, pure Shiva value. You see? But then we have Lord Narayana, Vishnu. Lord Narayana, of course, includes that value, that Shiva value. But you could almost say it's almost like there's more, if you will, an emphasis. There's no right word for it, but we could say an emphasis on the full structure that emerges out of that Shiva value. So that self-interacting dynamic, one becomes two, becomes three, cascades out into infinity. It becomes a wholeness of a totality that is a continuum that is foundational to and the very nature of the structure of relative existence. Sometimes they try to compare, or I try to compare the two. If Shiva is like the sun, the Vishnu value would be like the rays of the sun radiating out into all levels of relativity. But you see, really, there's no difference. Shiva, Lord Narayana, in a way you could say it's different faces of God, different ways of viewing the whole dynamic. But what's interesting is these aren't just names of gods, they're mantras. Shiva, Narayana, Narayana. And so those mantras have unique flavor to each, a unique quality to each. They aren't just names for, but they're actually embodiments of, in the very word itself, embodiments of the value of those subtle distinctions. Even like in the name Narayana, Na, back onto the absolute, Ra, emerging into all levels of relativity, Narayana, back and forth. And what's really interesting is if you put your attention on those, either value and go deeply within, what you find is that the Shiva value is just like unbounded, no thingness, no thoughts, pure being consciousness. That's it. Now, when you do that with Narayana, it ultimately ends up, that same unbounded thing, that one foundational source of everything. But with Narayana, the value is actually within the physiology. You can feel it almost awakening and enlivening. You could even say the different chakras, the whole energy system. It's almost like the very sound itself kind of adjusts and aligns and integrates to all levels of the physiology, all levels of existence, all the chakras, the whole thing like that. And you can actually feel it. Whereas with the Shiva value, it tends to be more just pure consciousness, pure unbounded eternal bliss. You see? And that's just the nature of existence. Yes, Scotty?
I was wondering what in the nature of existence starts this whole cycle of consciousness becoming aware of itself. Why did it do that? Or
it's just inherent in the nature of isness. Isness equals consciousness. And so what's the nature of isness? What's the nature of consciousness? Its very nature is to become conscious of. And so if nothing else exists other than consciousness, what can it become conscious of? Itself. So it's just inherent in its own very nature. That's the why, that's the what, that's the how. It's inherent in the nature of isness. It's very amazing. Consciousness equals isness. This is all just the play of consciousness, you see? Make sense?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Simple.
Yeah, it's remarkably beautiful, remarkably simple, and look what it unfolds, Now, there's also Rudra. There's Shiva. Some people would say, well, Rudra is just another name for Shiva. And in a sense, that's true, but actually there's a distinction there in that the Shiva value, basically has nothing to do with relativity. It's just pure transcendent. Beyond opinion, beyond perspective, just pure unbounded awareness. The eternal witness, without opinion, you see? But now what happens, and in the temple every day, the pundit does the Rudra shake. And what is that? It's a technology. It's a yajna. It's a technology whereby that Shiva value wells up into relativity. And when it does that, because you see, it's the source of all that perfection of the self-interacting dynamic of oneness, that whole mechanic. So when that value wells up, the harmony that wells up with it kind of like casts off anything that is not in tune with it. That's why they call Shiva the destroyer, because when that value emerges as Rudra into relativity, anything that's not consistent with the inner divinity of every individual, everything, is just melted away, dissolved, blown away. And that's represented by, Shiva, the destroyer, So we have two different values here. Then we have the Shiva value emerging as Rudra that casts off the impurities. But then we have Narayana, which in contrast to that, just enlivens the coherence. So it's, in a way, it's not attacking the impurities, so much as it's enlivening and aligning everything in the physiology in the universe. It's the upholder of the integration of everything. But it's also interesting that they're so intimately connected that one is the other. Because if all the impurities are cast aside, what do you have? Perfect coherence, perfect integration, perfect harmony. And that's just by virtue of casting off the impurities. On the other hand, if you align everything with that source of perfection within, what do you end up with? Same thing. Perfect alignment, perfect coherence. So it's like two aspects of the same one thing, you see?
What introduces the imperfections into the system? Because it's emanating from this perfection, right? It's coming welling up, and it's perfect. Yeah. And then if there's nothing else, and it's just interacting with itself as perfection, but
well, you can look at it. You can look at it in different ways. There's really an infinite number of different ways to respond to that. But one way, which I think is beautiful, is that, okay, the universe manifests, right? Look at it that way. And you get this feel of perfection, all the grass, the trees, everything, the sky, the clouds, it's just all perfect, right? And within that structure, within that system, there are an infinite number of different structures inherent in it. Just like the Sri Yantra is the geometric representation of that perfection inherent in the nature of the absolute. And within that geometric structure, it's like looking at a kaleidoscope. You can pull out limitless different patterns. It's all the dance around, I don't know, the two colors or the three colors, or it's all the dance around the four spindles that project out, but then again, there are five spindles. And so all these different structures get within the absolute, within relativity. Then we have these structures even on the surface of life. Trees, one structure, one fundamental DNA structure. Plants, people, animals, another. But they're all representations, if you will, of that totality of wholeness. All the structures, they're expressions of it. And so they're all naturally gravitating back to it. They're all resonating with that fullness, even though they are displaying more lively one aspect, be it the tree aspect, or another aspect, be it a bird aspect. And so as they gravitate back, there's the flip side of that is there's a limitation component. It's like if you have a child, the child is learning. As the child grows up, the child learns. But there's too much to learn all at once. It's just not going to happen. So we start with simpler models, simpler systems, simpler limitations. We don't start teaching them, how to compose a symphony orchestra. We'll teach them Mary Had a Little Lamb or something simple. But within that, then, it's just the nature of the exquisiteness of the dazzle of everything that the identity gets lost to that thingness, to that limitation. And so as that limitation then kind of takes over and dominates the mentality, dominates the perspective that individual has on everything in relativity, limitation creeps in, imbalance creeps in. And that's where the imbalance comes from. And see, that's why another important point here is that there's the Shiva value and the Vishnu value, the Narayana value. It's like there's the heart and the mind. And now, which is the heart and which is the mind? You could say that Shiva is the heart of the whole thing. And the Narayana value is the mind because it's the mechanic. But on the other hand, that mechanic has a music to it. It's just like there's a mechanic to the structure of who we are as human beings, but it's not that mechanic that we interface and see as who that human being is. It's the personified value. It's the heart value. So within the structure, which is a mechanic, is contained the heart, and within the heart, which is that pure, unbounded totality, which is the source of the mechanic of the manifestation, self-interacting dynamic set theory, if you will. One then is the source of the other. So, a kite needs a tail to soar. And so you can ask the question, well, which is the kite and which is the tail? Which is Shiva and which is Vishnu? It can be argued either way, and even arguing isn't the right way to say it. They're both. You see?
Mm-hmm.
It's a beautiful thing. That's how that whole mechanic of existence works,
It seems like almost as everything comes out of this self-interacting dynamic and it starts to collapse down into point values too, that things start to interact on those point values, and so they start bumping into each other, and maybe
you could say it that way. And why do they bump into each other? Because there's a loss of identity. See, the thing is so dazzling, it's so exquisite, it's so beautiful that even the self loses itself to a limited viewpoint. And that's the birth of the chit, which is our stuff, our issues, our programming, the subconscious mind, which dictates to the conscious mind what it really thinks, and then the conscious mind just justifies the subconscious, which is the limited awareness, And so it's just a beautiful and remarkable dynamic. And it's all about the dance, really. Narayana, Shiva, Rudra. It's beautiful. They're really, really beautiful. And it's important. It's really important that we understand this, because if we get too caught up in the physics of the thing, of the mechanic of the thing, then we compromise our interface with the personified quality. It becomes sterile. Like they asked Einstein, can you explain the sunset in terms of pure physics? He said, yes, you can, but if you do, it loses its meaning. On the other hand, if you get completely caught up in the personified component, then that underlying structure, that perfect structure, can get neglected and lost through that same mechanic we're talking about. And so that's where we get off on the fairy tales and La La Land and twisted notions of divinity. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody has to be a rigorous scientist and a rigorous, heartfelt poet, if you will. Not on the surface of life. But those two things integrate in the depth of our being, so that somebody who has claims on the surface of life, they have no interest in physics, say. But because their physiology is so well aligned and well integrated, what they do when they play music or do whatever it is they do, it stays rooted. That kite has a tail of the rational, even though it's not embraced as rational in the same way of scientists might embrace it as rational. It's a physiological thing. You see? And this is fundamentally important. It's foundational. It's the essential key to understanding. In fact, not just understanding the bigger picture, it is the bigger picture of what's going on here. I've said before, I remember when I was a little kid, I'd look at my parents and their friends and everything, and they were all so busy doing this, doing that. But if you asked them what it was about, they were like, well, you know, do we take care of our family and it's good. And then there's God and that's good, you know. But there's not much rigorous understanding of how all that comes together. So it's like we're so busy doing things, but we don't really have the context clearly understood. That is foundational to the whole thing. And that's how we can get off on tangents that are not correct, that are not in harmony with the big picture. If you're not in touch with the big picture, it's not really possible to live in harmony with the big picture, you see? All right, Scotty, is that it? I think that's enough for this week.
That should give everybody something to chew on.
Yeah, okay. Well, everybody, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this, and look forward to talking with you again next week.